Hey all, thanks for watching. It's Thursday, January 8th, and we're seeing the first, what I think will be two low pressure systems moving through the middle part of the country over the next 72 hours. The first one now wrapping up into Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas here this morning. You can see those radar returns with thunderstorms and showers overspreading the southern plains here this morning. I've overlaid on top of this cape, that's that potential energy and instability for those thunderstorms, and that's starting to creep north. You kind of see those values spiking up into like 250 to 500. That's kind of, you're getting to that point where we're just starting to get into thunderstorm territory. If you really want kind of like vigorous, severe weather, you need to get up over like at least 1,000 and then thereafter. But you start getting up into 500, you get some decent, thunderstorm activity starting to sprinkle in. And we're seeing that here in like central Oklahoma, west of the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area and the Oklahoma City metro areas. That's going to be quickly moving through to the east, crossing those metro areas kind of around rush hour here this morning. Now, if I jump over and look at the lightning map, these storms are electric, a little bit impressively so. I didn't expect this much lightning and thunder associated with them, at least kind of from that radar presentation and kind of that meager cape, but plenty of thunderstorm and electricity in these systems. If I jump over and look at the NOAA All Hazards map here this morning, we'll go west to east here. These pink winter storm warnings over in the Cascades, those are going to be allowed to expire. I'm kind of surprised they haven't already, but just some lingering snow showers moving through the mountains there. That event largely waning at this point. If you look through California, the cold weather advisories, those are slowly kind of being taken away near the San Francisco area and south. Those are in those blue colors. And then if you look further to the south, wind advisories through much of Southern California. And then that like more like mustardy color, that like darker beige, I guess, that is the high wind warnings for a lot of the mountains there, like San Gabriel and over through the transverse ranges. With the Santa Ana wind event that we're expecting tonight and a little bit tomorrow and Friday, it's going to be more like your typical, average Santa Ana wind event. Definitely some, gusty winds in particular corridors getting up over to like, 55 miles an hour into 60 miles an hour. But I'm not expecting kind of widespread damage reports from this, but definitely a windy evening overnight tonight. But with that limited fire risk, thankfully, from all the rainfall that we've had in that area. Seeing again those winter weather advisories, a few winter storm warnings in the Rockies, particularly the southern Rockies here, as this low pressure system, we kind of identified it right there spinning up the backside of that over those areas now, but another low coming in behind that system, which is going to rev up here on Friday and Saturday. So we'll talk about that as we go through there. But some of these advisories are more connected to that next system. Over the middle part of the country, pretty quiet. We have these fog advisories here. That system that we were talking about yesterday has left off the eastern seaboard. So despite the fog and cloudiness, waiting on this system to move toward the northeast today, which it will, bringing that rain shield further to the north, and perhaps some of that thunder as well, pushing into the Midwest like Missouri and southern Illinois as we go through the day today. If we jump over, just look at the top of the atmosphere here. I'm starting at like 500 millibars here, maybe we'll call that the mid-levels. I can identify two features of note here. One, that first shortwave responsible for the low pressure system here this morning. That's this little kind of kink in the line here in that jet stream level flow, and you're probably looking at this other one kind of right over Sacramento here. Also coming around this long wave trough. So here's the broader long wave trough, and we look for these little features embedded in it, kind of rotating around it, that drive a lot of these individual low pressure systems that we're watching here at the end of this week, and then all through spring. This is a common kind of pattern. In fact, we have this pattern in spring where we're talking about like more significant severe weather across the southern plains and the southeast with a system like this. Like current temperatures here this morning, I'm recording this about 6 a.m. Central, 7 a.m. Eastern. I'll update this here. See that freezing line, relative to mid-January, arguably our coldest time of year climatologically, depending on where exactly you are in the continental U.S. or Canada. And that freezing line pretty far north. We have some embedded freezing values here, kind of the D.C. metro area, west of the Appalachians into southern Ohio, but still pretty far north given that stream of moisture and warmer air is coming up out of the south. It looks like we have an artifact from a poor measurement here near like Savannah, Georgia. Look at those high temperatures forecast here today from the National Weather Service. That's the NDFD, National Digital Forecast Database from the NWS. Colder temperatures to the west behind that low pressure system and predictably out ahead of it. Look at the warmth coming up into the Midwest. So warm to finish the month of December, and we've been warm here at times here to start the month of January. It's been an impressive swing from where we were at the end of November through the holidays, or at least in the beginning part of the holidays, where we were much colder than average for a large area of the country. 60s today across the Midwest, 70s, and even getting down to the 80s as you go across the South, 50s and 40s across the eastern U.S., 30s up into the northern plains, and then Got to kind of look hard to find 28 degree Fahrenheit here north of Fargo. If I take this forecast into tomorrow with that next low pressure system kind of rounding the base of that trough, that warmth spreads east a little bit, and that cold air kind of settles into the Four Corners region there. We saw a lot of those winter advisories and warnings. If we take this in through Saturday and then Sunday, finally Saturday, that cold front swings through the Midwest, leaving colder temperatures on Sunday for the Midwest and the southern U.S. The warmth kind of pushed further off to the Atlantic coast, and then behind it, that warm up coming in behind this system this weekend, already appearing in the northern plains, the Canadian prairie, by Sunday during the day. That continues to spread east on Monday and Tuesday. By the point next week on Wednesday, we've spread milder temperatures back over a wide area of the country. Now, this NDFD forecast ends on Wednesday. If it went out Thursday, Friday, you'd start to see the cold weather return back to this corridor here. And I think that's going to start, the initial pattern change back to colder weather in this area here. Maybe even this whole corridor. We'll look at that in a few slides here as we go warmer west and cooler east at the end of January here. Before I get too far ahead, I do want to mention the Storm Prediction Center has a marginal risk out for this area here. Not surprised that they haven't gone any higher than that. I haven't seen any severe reports yet from that line here this morning. It's not expected to strengthen too significantly today. And with just kind of all the rain and the lack of sunshine getting in here, not seeing much in the way of instability getting too much further north. But really, you can kind of outline this area here as the potential for seeing some thunder today. Can't rule out, a stronger storm with a gusty wind. Gust, maybe a weak tornado, but even that would surprise me at this point. What I was talking about earlier, those shortwave troughs, we saw those kind of embedded in the flow. We can also plot these via mid-level vorticity. So that's what I showed this yesterday. We're really just plotting spin at this level of the atmosphere. That's 500 millibars. So that's what this plot kind of conveniently does for us. And the reason we do that, it really kind of points out those shortwave troughs. We don't have to look so hard at the jet stream plot I showed you earlier. So there's that first system, but it nicely identifies that next system kind of over Lake Tahoe, Sacramento. So today, Thursday, that first system pushes up in the Midwest. That's why we saw that marginal risk area extending toward the northeast, not like extending east through the southeast. And this next system behind it settles into the Four Corners regions tomorrow morning on Friday. This is about 24 hours from now as this current system exits up through the Midwest, maybe leaving a narrow snow band through the upper Midwest. I'll talk about that in a moment. And as this one rounds the base of that trough, it starts to cut itself off a bit. Just kind of gets left behind. And that allows that, I mentioned yesterday, that Chihuahuan shortwave to kind of sneak across the southeast. Now it's looking, like that origin's coming a little bit more out of the south in the state of Chihuahua. And you can see that there, just one of these little filaments ripping across the southeast on Friday. So that'll be a focus point potentially for some severe weather. I will say the presentation of this now, kind of originating a little bit further south, doesn't tell me it's going to be maybe quite as severe as we initially thought yesterday, but still enough to kind of kick off some thunderstorms in the mid-south, maybe near the Memphis area or south of there through Mississippi and Alabama. We'll look at the Storm Prediction Center in a second here. That second system wraps up. Pieces of it get left behind, but another deeper low wraps up over the Midwest, and that's kind of our second system that we're watching on Saturday. Some playoff games being played there, maybe some implications for that, for areas played outside in the elements. And as we go through Sunday, that continues to spin toward the east as this system, we'll watch it kind of wrap up and exit out of the area toward the northeast. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm going to let this play out. You'll notice next week, not too much to look at, kind of have a weak, broad trough here, but it's hard to find one of those deep shortwave troughs in it, right? We don't see any clear identifiable shortwave trough. We do see this mega ridge over California to the west, ending the kind of heavy precipitation all across the western, the Pacific of the U.S., Pacific coast, but even into British Columbia, like a lack of flow up there. And we're kind of waiting for this trough here to consolidate a little more late next week. As you can see, some of these systems trying to swing through, but they don't have any access to moisture given their trajectory, almost like due north to south. So very little access to any sort of Gulf moisture, and it's making it hard for any of these to wrap up into like a big wintertime system. But again, I'll look at that in a second. I do want to double back really quick with that system wrapping up on tomorrow on Friday, that little system coming through the southeast. The Storm Prediction Center sticking with that slight risk now. They've kind of truncated a little bit further south into the west here. I don't disagree with that. So looking at any areas from like Tupelo down through central Louisiana, maybe portions of northern New Orleans for some stronger severe thunderstorms tomorrow. But again, just a slight risk level, kind of 2 out of 5, if you will, on their scale. Look at the ECMWF precipitation forecast, kind of putting together what we just looked at going forward. That initial system, I'll take this out to lunchtime Thursday, somewhere located near Kansas City. That rainfall spreading north this evening. This is now getting into rush hour tonight, Central Time, 7 p.m. Eastern. Snow on the backside of this over the Four Corners. Rain across southern Arizona in the lower elevations like Phoenix, even like Tucson, getting close to that rain-snow line. This low wrapping up tonight. This is midnight, and there's that narrow snow swath I mentioned, ECMWF through northwest Iowa, like Mason City, like Minocqua, all the way up into the upper peninsula of Michigan here. But it's going to be brief, so it's going to be hard to get like significant accumulations, I think, in Iowa and portions of Wisconsin. If you get further toward the northeast, better chances for more significant snowfall accumulations up there. But boy, they're used to it up there. They've had plenty of snowfall. So we go through the day. On Friday, this takes us all the way out to lunchtime on Friday. We have a long cold front through here. That'll be a focal point for storms across the south as that shortwave trough comes over, that little one that I mentioned. And then a brief shot of heavy snow here across southeast Colorado, Pueblo, down through like far northern reaches of the Panhandle, western Kansas. And you can see that quickly dissipate. And this is now midnight. See more severe storms potentially. Keep an eye in here, southern Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. As I take this forecast now all the way Saturday lunchtime, that second system trying to wrap up over the Midwest. Weak snowfall here forecast over the upper Midwest. Additional rainfall now coming through the south and the mid-Atlantic. Before that pushes further east, and we get some lake effect snow on the backside of it. Some weak showers here over like the Allegheny and western PA, but struggling to wrap up in like this deep system, leaving a huge snow swath across a significant portion of the country at this point. By this time on Sunday, starting to see some flow return back to the northwest Washington, getting in on some rainfall here, maybe far northwest Oregon. By and large, starting to look like a calmer pattern earlier next week. As ridging develops out west, we lose a lot of that precipitation signal, and by Wednesday and Thursday, some of those weak kind of little systems sneaking through that broader weak trough starting to move through the eastern U.S., but you're not seeing like any big system here, right? We don't have that flow. We would need that trough in a position somewhere like this or even like that or like that to get, flow to wrap up here into a big wintertime system. Right now, with that big ridge next week like that, and the flow coming out of the northwest, you're kind of dependent on either clipper systems or just kind of weak low pressure systems in general. And so we don't see one of these wrap up into a big system really throughout the forecast period on the ECMWF. If I nitpick the GFS, I can find a little bit better signal for like a winter storm in the long range for the GFS. I'll go over and show that now. There are some kind of little differences here, even with this current system coming through. Thursday, again, has that narrow snow swath through Iowa into Wisconsin. Play this in tomorrow. Actually, the GFS has been holding on to maybe some more stronger storms tomorrow on Saturday. This is Friday evening. This is now midnight, Saturday morning. So going to have to keep an eye on that in like Mississippi, Louisiana, far western Alabama, southern Arkansas through midnight tomorrow. Next system wraps up. The GFS has kept that snow line a little bit further south through like Chicago and Michigan. This is on the evening of Saturday. Rainfall through the mid-Atlantic and portions of the southeast here. GFS, again, exits that system east. You can see it weakening all the while. Next week, at least early next week, calmer. Waiting on the systems to move through north to southeast through the eastern part of the country, but you're not seeing any like significant system by Wednesday. Weak clipper systems may be moving through the plains. This is all the way out till Saturday, all the way out to January 17th at this point. And the GFS tries to, spin something up through the Midwest with that colder air available. But again, way out here, your past 10 days in the forecast, can't talk too many specifics. We do see is a very calm and warm, quiet western U.S. through the forecast period. Look at the next 5 days of temperatures. This is from the ECMWF ensemble. Warmer east here as we finish the week this week. That's clear from the low pressure system swinging up. That source region out of the south, bringing those warmer temperatures. As we go into next week, we start to transition that heat moving more to the west, starting to bring more seasonal air back out of the north into the south at this point. And as we go even further into the long range from that ensemble forecast, see a much bigger pattern shift on the way after that, starting like next week and going out and beyond that. So January 18th through the 23rd, much colder air returning to the Canadian prairie and shots of that moving through the Midwest into the Northeast, maybe at times even through the Southeast. So much colder pattern advertised as we get further toward the end of the month at this point. Warmer in the west, cooler in this corridor here. Before I go too far into the long range, I do want to look at just at the total rainfall forecast. This is from the WPC out of the National Weather Service. Now, highlights a corridor here kind of overlapping where we saw that slight risk into the marginal risk on Saturday. And I'll double back and show that really quick. This was there's that Friday slight risk, marginal slight risk, or the marginal risk on Friday, just level 1 out of 5 at this point for severe weather extending up into the Carolinas a bit here. But really, a good chance for rain across a wide area of the south, and it needs it. It's had a lack of rainfall this winter. Certainly, by about any measure, significant precipitation deficits through this area. If we pull them up just over the last 30 days, 3 to 4 inches below average through the end of December into early January at this point. Been plenty of wet out west, plenty of flow coming through here, but the high pressure system and the lack of precipitation and cloud cover has dominated in this area here, despite some fog here recently. If we look at the snowfall forecast, this is just from the ECMWF. There's that narrow corridor. And you'll notice, despite decent values, at least in terms of that rate being forecast on a few slides ago, don't see too heavy of accumulations until you get into narrow swaths here in Iowa and Minnesota, maybe getting up into 3 to 4 inches. You have to go really further northeast up into the North Woods as you start to get up over 5 or 6 inches at this point. But it's a narrow swath at this point. But the confidence on the location of that swath has been pretty decent. If I switch you back between the ECMWF and the GFS, largely in decent agreement as to where exactly that swath sets up. But again, it's narrow. There's going to be a lot of people kind of missing out on some of this. The GFS with that second system on Saturday brings a little bit of a dusting, some more better accumulations into Michigan as that system kind of wraps up here. But again, you're not seeing a widespread significant snowfall event for Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, or even portions of Indiana at this point. More so over here over Ontario or in the North Woods at this point. I do want to pull up the ECMWF ensemble. We were looking at this a second ago in temperatures, but might as well pull up that 500 millibar pattern to look at the troughs and the ridges here. I'll take this forecast quickly through the current period. There's that Saturday system kind of pushing off to the east. We're quiet next week under the influence of a dominant ridge across the western U.S. and not really too much else to look at across the eastern U.S. But as I play the forecast forward, Tuesday and Wednesday, we start to see troughing settle into the west, but the trajectory of that trough, how it came in out of the north, doesn't have a lot of access to moisture, so that's not why we're not seeing a lot of significant winter weather next week. As we go through Friday, Saturday, Sunday, all the way through next weekend, seeing that trough linger here, that's going to allow that cold air continuing to push out of the north through this corridor here. We'll have some clipper systems, I think, sneak through, but we're struggling to see kind of a big system here. We're also seeing that dominant ridge positioned over California, over the western U.S. It's starting to retreat, as they often do, further back over the Pacific, and that's going to allow this trough to follow it west a bit. So as I play this forecast forward, as this trough settles in over the Canadian prairie, that helps to bring in that much colder air. This is often you can think of this as your savings bank for cold air in winter. So as we cool this off, the chances that we can then spend it, if you will, across the Midwest or the eastern U.S., even portions down into the southeast or the Gulf Coast, starts to increase a bit. So that's why you're seeing those colder temperature forecasts pick up as you get further out into the month of January here, as that ridge retreats further off into the Pacific. Now, if this retreats even further, starts to amplify a bit, we get back into a pattern we were familiar with in December, but not quite seeing that yet from the long-range forecast at this point. If we put this together in the temperature panel, see if we can make this a little bigger. I'll back it up just a bit there. If we look at the two ensembles from the GFS and the ECMWF ensemble, that better cold air signal across a wide area of the continental U.S. and Canada at this point in that day through 10 through the 15th, starting now. So that's the January 18th through the 23rd. Curiously, the ECMWF AIFS, which is one operational model run, doesn't have nearly as much cold settling into the prairie at this time, but that's also why we run the ensembles. We run 100 different members, and the vast majority are showing cold air right now. The AFS, just being one member, happens to be a little bit more of an outlier with the warmth here. But it's important to point out the nuances. When you get out this far into the forecast, 10 to 15 days, we can't sell the barn on this occurring. Definitely chances are higher than not that that's likely to occur. And the Storm Prediction Center is starting to bend that way, with temperatures coming down now 15th through the 21st across the Midwest, with the warmth retreating over the western U.S. We can see this a bit. If we look at the hobmullers, this is something we looked at again and again in December, mainly because of this feature here. So if we go back in time, which is up on this map from the black line, that horizontal black line. What we saw through December, through early January, was this dominant, record-breaking North Pacific ridge kind of positioned over the Aleutians in the Pacific. And that just sat there, and it allowed troughs to amplify across the western U.S. The longitude here, we can draw all the way down into the map below. So like this was here, bringing all that rainfall to California, portions of Washington, even Oregon at time. And that allowed, over and over again, ridging to largely dominate across the central U.S. And that warmth to spread in over Christmas and the other holidays. And in early January, more ridging with kind of brief troughs moving through more so the eastern U.S. versus anything. But now, here's present day, the 8th, as we go out into the forecast, as that ridge kind of settles more so here over the western U.S. or just to the west of the coast, we're seeing better troughing in the long range, about the 17th through maybe the 25th, maybe even longer. You can kind of see this maybe settling into a more dominant pattern here as this whole pattern retrogrades a bit or moves east to west. So it wouldn't surprise me if we stick around maybe in a more dominant troughing pattern across the continental U.S. through the end of the month, maybe even into early January. Another factor we have to consider here is a different Hobmuller diagram. We're going further south. We can see that in the map below on this map. The Central Pacific, where La Nina has settled in, obviously, this winter. The kind of forecasts have shifted toward that El Nino potential into the new year, here, 2026. Right now, still hanging on to that La Nina, but as we go through further out into the forecast, i.e. down on this plot, if you look at like January 16th, we start to see an impressive westerly wind burst in the trade winds. So the trade winds over this area here in the Central Pacific are typically blowing, like this, east to west, depending on which side of the equator you're on. You have that kind of northeast or that southeast component to it. But they're blowing like this. And when they're stronger than average, i.e. these blue colors, they're helping to upwell more water. They're helping to entrench La Nina in this corridor here. But when you reverse that typical trade wind flow and you start to slow those down and you even get like westerly wind bursts through this area, well, now you start to warm up that water in the Central Pacific, i.e. more rapidly weaken La Nina. So as we see these westerly wind bursts pick up in the Central Pacific in the forecast here from the ECMWF, I picked the AFS in this case, but you're seeing the same pattern from the ensembles. We're going to start eroding La Nina here with this impressive westerly wind burst. The other thing we're going to do is if you follow the westerly wind burst in the forecast where it meets up with the easterlies, well, you have convergence here necessarily. If you have west winds here, east winds here, they're going to converge here over 150 west. You're getting way out into the Pacific now. That's like more phase 8 in the long range of this forecast for the MJO, like 7 and 8. And that could be an interesting scenario as we get further out into January and February at this point. The Hobmullers right now tell that story. If we look over at the phase diagram for the MJO, this is from the ECMWF extended. Forecast has it extending into phase 6 here soon this week, then into phase 7 next week. As we go further and further out, maybe a transition from 7 to 8. And if we look at those phases, climatologically, like phase 8 in late January, phase 8 in early February, surprisingly, ridging further west, maybe even like northwest over Canada starts to show up in the data, troughing further east. Besides looking at like the exact position here of where these troughs and ridges are, I'm not seeing that same signal for warmth that we were seeing in early January or December, at least for the central or eastern U.S. I'm also not seeing necessarily, despite a phase 8, a fantastic pattern for west precipitation as well, which we typically look for that like phase 7 to 8 transition. You do see that extension of the Pacific Jet. If that gets further to the east, might start getting into California at some point in this transition from 6, 7, and 8, maybe later on in February. At least right now with that ridging kind of dominating in some of these climatological lookbacks, I'm not seeing that huge switch over back toward wet for California in the long range. I do see better signal for cold air in the long range, though, given this presentation. If we do plug in La Nina phase 8s in February specifically, I tried to pull up here, we do see more ridging over the western U.S., maybe a little bit better flow in like British Columbia and Washington, but again, troughing more so over the central, if not more so the eastern U.S., and cold air likely as a result of that. So as we look further out into the forecast, into January, starting to get into February, if we transition into phase 8, seeing that better signal for cold air east and then questionable precipitation, I think, for the western U.S. If this holds true, this kind of This is looking back. La Nina phase 8s in February, maybe better precipitation for the Pacific Northwest than the like California areas. If we look at the long-range forecast from the ECMWF extended, this takes us all the way out through February 22nd. Surprisingly, this lines up pretty well. Now, that's going to make sense because it was the ECMWF extended. It's the same model that we kind of played out that phase 8 scenario that it has forecast there. So not surprised to see better signal for more inclement weather in the east with the trough there that we looked at, and then that better flow potentially over the Northwest, bring more rainfall there to the Cascades. They could use it in Southern Oregon, even despite some of that recent snowfall there. Now, temperature-wise, looking at the same map, if we look all the way out, again, toward February 22nd, so this is January 22nd through February 22nd, really gets us all the way, almost out through that whole month there. Colder in the Northwest, colder in the Northeast, with some warmth here across the Southern Plains. In the Southeast or the Gulf Coast. That's just one forecast scenario playing out. We're seeing it maybe in that MJO transition. But again, don't see as much signal for that kind of anomalous warmth that folks have enjoyed in this corridor or this corridor over the last 30 days or so. I also think that some of this cold air over the southwestern U.S. is initialized incorrectly based on current snowfall and cold air that settled in here now this week. We kind of saw that, all those winter advisories there. I really see the cold air signal more materially like up in this corridor here from this forecast over the Canadian Prairie. I'm skeptical this area would stay cold if we go over colder in the eastern U.S. in February. I think that's my last slide today. I'll end it there. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow on Friday, and we'll continue to track this kind of El Nino potential later in the month. It's worth mentioning, I'll pull up kind of before I end here, it's the plumes here from the ECMWF ensemble, the latest one that shows, every member of the ECMWF seasonal forecast. Let's pull up the latest one in January that we've been looking at. Every member getting us pretty close to El Nino by summer. These forecasts are not perfect, and just because all the members give us an envelope here does not mean, that the actual scenario that plays out has to land somewhere inside that. It could, buck trend, end up in an extreme El Nino territory by July, or even down here into something like INSO neutral. Do I think we're going to stay in La Nina? No, I think those chances are pretty low. But just because the ECMWF model says this is going to happen with every member doesn't mean this is a locked-in trend. It's almost every year we see this forecast pick up on incorrect trend, and then the model has to update as we go through like February and March. So El Nino definitely better chances than not at this point, but maybe like 60%. It's not like a 90%, even with all the model agreements. So we'll continue to have to track that as we go through the end of January, February, and March a bit as we narrow down where 2026 is going at this point. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you all next week.